Genesis. If you have a Bible, everybody should have a Bible nearby so you can follow along in the passage. It's so important to read it together and talk about it together. And we're going to be taking a look at this passage here today in Genesis chapter 30. Genesis chapter 30. Now, it's Father's Day today, and I was thinking about it. I must say something about Father's Day. Not necessarily, really. We don't have to follow the custom of our day. What we will say is this, is that all these passages at the moment are about fathers, because each one of the people mentioned in the passages, like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, they were all fathers, and they were called the patriarchs. And we all know, don't we, that the word patriarch, it's referring really to fathers. So it's a very appropriate passage to be looking at today. I will read from verse 1. That when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." Now we'll ignore the fact that Jacob was dealing with a very distraught wife. That's one of the things of being a father. That's one of the things that sometimes we have to do. It's the pressures of family life are usually very great anyway. In this particular case, it had the added difficulty of having no child. And we all know the desperation that mothers have when they find that they are not conceiving. It affects the fathers too, and it creates great strain in the family. And in this particular case, the strain was not just between Rachel and Jacob, but it was between the two sisters. Okay, they were living in tents. They were living very closely associated. They were seeing each other. There were no multiple rooms, so they were seeing each other at every meal. And dear old Rachel was getting more and more upset. I don't think that Leah was particularly helpful, probably. She no doubt was very excited about her child. So the idea was that there was tension in the family. And this is something that happens. I was the youngest of 6 children, so I had 2 sisters. So I know a little bit about the tension that happens between sisters as well as between brothers and between father and son and so on. Sometimes families have an awful lot. And she is getting very desperate at this stage. She says it, "Give me children or else I die." I think she's been a little bit over dramatic there. I don't think she was thinking of really dying, but she was getting very upset and very desperate. And Jacob was angry with her. Verse 2, and Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in God's stead, or am I in God's place? He has withheld from thee the fruit of the womb." And she said, "Well, this is my hand. Behold, my hand Bilhah. Go into her." In other words, be married to her. "And she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her." It was the custom in those days for slave women in the family to marry the husband or the head of the house if there was no children, in order for the inheritance to be passed on to the future generations. And this was considered to be perfectly normal. We wouldn't consider it normal today. It would be forbidden today to act in this manner. And it was something that God never really desired, but it was something that he allowed people to do in certain circumstances. And in this particular case, it was so important that Jacob's children should exist, because they're the future generations that are going to have all the blessing of God. And they knew that that was going to take place. And the only conceivable way that they could imagine that they would have future generations is if Jacob had a child. And if it came from the handmaiden, that would be okay. And don't forget that in a marriage like this, in which it's a concubine, so the woman is a wife, she's a wife in the fullest sense, but she's also a slave. Now, anybody that's a slave can function in the family, they can have children, okay? But the children don't come into the inheritance, nor does the slave wife come into the inheritance either. And of course, they can leave at any time, or when they leave with nothing. So this is the arrangement. She said, verse 3, behold, my handmaid Bilhah, go into her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. And she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife, and Jacob went in unto her. That's the expression used in the Bible when it talks about marriage. And Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son. So this was not an illicit relationship. It was not adultery. It was not fornication. It was none of those things. It was a legal marriage. We see that in the next passage. However, the reaction is going to be not great. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. Now, don't forget, the slave girl belonged to Rachel. She belonged to her like property. And any children that she would have would become her son. You see, so she refers to the boy as her son. God hath given me a son. Then verse 7, and Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. So now, this is the first and the second son, but not of Rachel. Is the first and second son of the servant girl. Now, this was not in the mind of God, because the Lord promised to Abraham and to his seed that they would have sons, and they would have family that would stretch on into the future. Even they exist all today, of course. So this was not in the mind of God. This was what you would call an expediency. You may not be familiar with that word. It worked. That's the point. It worked. A child was born, and that's all that everybody wanted. But it was not the way in which God ever intended it to happen. That's the point. And so this is the story of Jacob's life, I'm afraid. Jacob's life was a life of expediency. We'll see it later in the passage today. Now, in the life of the Christian and in the life of a church, there are three evils that we must always resist. So get a piece of paper, write these down. These are really important. You'll see them cropping up in church life. You'll see it cropping up in a business meeting. You'll see it cropping up in all sorts of ways in churches, and they're always a bad thing, or virtually always a bad thing. The first one is expediency. Expediency means, well, if it works, then that's fine. I've heard it say in previous churches and here, we'll just fill the church with people. That's what we wanted, or more people, so we can have more money, so we can do more things, so that we can all be happy, we can all have more friends. Is that really everything that we need to talk about? I mean, there was a suggestion made in a previous church that what they would do, they would invite all the atheists and all the ungodly from the village to just come and be present at the church. We'll just fill the church with lots of people. That isn't really what we're about, really. It's not about filling the church with people. It's about filling the people of God with the Spirit of God. Now, do you see the difference? That's not the same, is it? So that's the first one, expediency. And the person that speaks about expediency says, well, look, it doesn't really matter how we do it. We just need to have a bigger church with lots more people and lots more money. No, that is not the way to go. The end doesn't always justify the means. That's the point. And what if we had a massive church full of people, but they were not real, true believers? Is that what we really want? No, not necessarily, no. The second thing is, you've got the first one then, expediency. The second one is development. By the way, these 3 points are not my ideas. They're something that I read a long, long time ago, but I found it to be true. The second one is development. What people say in development is, well, we're not living like the Apostle Paul lived. We're not living in the first century. We're not living like Jesus lived, because he was a Jew, so we don't need to listen to any of that. What they're saying is this, is that we're living modern lives. We're in the 21st century now. I hear people say all the time, we're in the 21st century now, so we can do this and we can do that and we can do the other. Is that really all that has to happen? Okay. I remember listening to Jack Moorman many, many years ago at a youth meeting. And he explained to the youth, he said, in my field next to my house, there's a donkey. He said, I could have come on the donkey today, but as it was, I came in the car. And it was a bit quicker, really. He said, but I could have done it on the donkey. Jesus rode on a donkey, so I could have come on a donkey, couldn't I? He said, but you know what? That's old-fashioned, isn't it? There are some things in life that are old-fashioned. We all know what old-fashioned means. And then he stood there and he went like this. He went, he said, should I do it again? No. He said, that's the old-fashioned way of staying alive. You see, some things never really go out of fashion, do they? The real things of life never go out of fashion. It's only fashion that goes out of fashion. So the fact that we're living in a modern age doesn't mean that we can just do whatever we feel like, just because it's expedient, just because it works. If it works, it must be right. Is that the only answer we have for our moral decisions? No. And then the third one, you'll know this one, but it's the application of it that's important, is the word tradition. Okay? And tradition is something that happens when somebody says, well, we've always done it that way. So if you've always done it that way, it must be right then. No. People in the past might have been making wrong decisions. They might have been not doing the right thing. So the fact that people have done it for a long time doesn't mean that we should carry on doing it automatically. Not automatically. And these are the great problems. And you can see this in the life of Jacob all the time. You know, I mean, you can imagine Sarah saying to Jacob, well, you know, look, it's not perfect, but if she's able to be pregnant, then why wouldn't we? Because it will work. You will end up having a son. And that's all you want, really, isn't it? A son. And the answer is yes, they did want a son, but they didn't want to do it that way. You see, there's ways and means of doing things, and some are not great at all, you know. And of course, you can imagine Rachel saying to Jacob, and it's very persuasive, he says, well, your grandfather did it. Abraham took a servant girl, didn't he? Yeah, but she's forgetting that it nearly broke the family into pieces, nearly divided the mother and father. And in the end, the young girl that was a servant girl that was causing trouble had to be sent away from the home to bring peace into the home again. So the fact that someone's always done it that way in the past doesn't mean that that's what we should be thinking of in the present. And it's very important in our lives as Christians and in church life in general to study a little bit of history. Nearly all the things and all the issues that we ever face in church life and in our personal life, they've been done before. And what we can do is we can learn from the past. You see, some of the things that happened in the past are a great example that we can follow. But some of the things that have happened in the past are a terrible thing that we should avoid. So the fact that it's been done like that in the past doesn't mean that it's automatically a good thing. Verse 9. Then Leah saw that she had left bearing. She took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her Jacob to wife. And Leah could have said, well, she's just done it, so I think I should do it as well. And it worked for her, so why shouldn't it work for us? You can see all the same thinking coming out again. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son, and Leah said, a troop cometh, and she called his name Gad. Now, Gad is a word that means a troop, a whole company of soldiers, it means. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. And Leah said, happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And she called his name Asher. And these are all the children of Israel. Asher was one of the tribes of Israel, along with Gad as a tribe of Israel. What we notice here is that this is the building up of the 12 sons of Jacob, which would become 12 separate tribes. They would become the children of Israel, the tribes of Israel. But you'll notice that there was strife in the home. There was strife between the two sisters, And this was going to sow seeds of terrible trouble in the future. When we follow the career of each of these men, you discover that they were an absolute washout. Some of them were viciously cruel. Some of them were murderers. Okay, even in a matter of a few chapters, we're going to find that they are a gang of murderers. That's what they were. You see, they were born. It wasn't their fault that they were born, nor the circumstances of their birth, but their character doesn't come out well. It's not going to be a good thing for Jacob and Rachel. This is a mess that's starting, which will bring great tears in the end. Verse 14, and Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes. Mandrakes, from what I can gather, was some sort of a vegetable that they could give to animals. And she said to her, is it a small matter that thou hast taken my husband? And wouldst thou now take away my son's vegetables also? Do you see, fights in families take place just over what vegetables you've got and who they belong to. It's quite sad, really. And it's really sad because it wasn't the mandrake's fault. It wasn't the food's fault. It was the conflict between the two women that was at fault. Okay. And Rachel said, therefore she shall lie with thee tonight for thy son's mandrakes. And Jacob came out of the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come in unto me, for surely I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. And he laid with her that night. Now this is when the women of the house are controlling the man of the house. And they're doing it through all their strange means. So they had the right idea. They wanted to have more children, but they went about it in absolutely the wrong way. It's even sad. It's embarrassing reading about it. I mean, I had a treasurer in previous years, and he was a lovely guy. And he said to me one day, he said, Stephen, he said, we're a bit short of money. I said, are you? Okay. What do you think? He said, well, he said, I think what we need to do, he said, I've got a tip on a horse. And I said, oh, have you? What's that then? He said, well, it's a particular horse in a race, like, the 2:30 at the races. And I said to him, I'm sorry, but you've just signed your resignation letter. You cannot take church funds which have been given to the Lord. They are holy. They are dedicated to God's service. You can't take something like that and gamble it away, hoping to get some more money. Do you understand? So the man had exactly the right sort of idea, but the way in which he would go about it to obtain more would be absolutely wrong. It would be taking money and giving it to unbelievers that they might gamble it on the speed of a horse. It's quite incredible what some people would say, and that's an example of people who have exactly the right idea, but just completely the wrong idea of knowing how to face it. Verse 17, and God hearkened unto Leah, and she conceived and bare Jacob the 5th son. So the family is growing, isn't it? And Leah says, God has given me my hire because I have given my maiden to my husband. And she called his name Issachar. And Leah conceived again and bare Jacob the 6th son. And Leah said, God hath endowed me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I am born of 6 sons. And she called his name Zebulun. And afterward she bare a daughter and called her name Dinah. Dinah was the 13th child. Well, not the 13th in order, but she was what you would call the last of this lady. And her name was called Dinah. So the children of Israel, not just all men, there was a young girl amongst them as well, which would bring great sadness to Jacob later. Verse 22, and God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb, and she conceived and bare a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. So she had this prophecy from the Lord Don't forget that in those days, the whole family was prophetic. This isn't something we have today. There are no prophets today. I want you to get that into your head. There are just no prophets today. And I hear it all the time. Prophet this, prophet that, saying this and saying that. Listen, the prophet's ministry has ceased today, absolutely categorically. It's not in evidence in the church today whatsoever. But she was a prophetess, and she lived in a family of prophets. And the Lord had spoken to her and told her that she would have another son. This wasn't going to be the only one. Of course, the first son she had was Joseph. And the second son, what was his name? What was Joseph's brother called? No. Benjamin. Benjamin was the last of the children. But that was going to be for another day. So now Rachel has reached a point in her life in which she has confidence in what? In God. That's it, verse 25. And it came to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said unto Laban, send me away, that I may go unto mine own place and to my own country. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served thee, and let me go, for thou knowest my service which I have done thee. So here comes the time of separation. It was convenient for Jacob to stay with Laban. He was there for at least 14 years and longer. But Laban, his uncle, had not been a good influence in his life. Sometimes that happens in families, doesn't it? Sometimes somebody in the family is just not a good influence. The things, you can only see this when you're looking back. You never see it when you're looking forward very often. But when you look back, you realize he was a proper rogue. A little bit like Jacob was too. They were of the same character, really. He was not a good man. However, God had blessed Laban because Jacob was there, because God was in the process of blessing Jacob. So Laban was in the same locality and he was getting blessing as well. It's just one of those things of life that happens. Verse 27, and Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry, for I have learned by experience that God has blessed me for thy sake. Now, you may not notice this as a Christian, but very often in life, God will bless the people that you're near to in family life because of you. They get some of the blessings from the Lord simply because they know you or are close to you. And that's just one of those things that happens. Verse 28, and he said, appoint me my wages, and I will give it. And he said unto him, thou knowest how I have served thee, and how thy cattle was with me. For it was little which thou hast before I came, and now it is increased into a multitude. So he says to Laban, look, when I came, you didn't have many sheep or cattle or anything. But because God has blessed me serving you, so you've got great multitudes of animals now. And Laban knew that. He understood that. But this is Jacob speaking. He says, the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming. Now, when shall I provide for my own house also? He's saying, look, this is your house. All the cattle and all the sheep are yours. What about what I'm going to have? That's a very reasonable thing. He's been there a long time serving, but he hasn't really got anything out of it except 2 wives and an awful lot of trouble. Verse 31, and he said, what shall I give thee? And Jacob said, thou shalt not give me anything. If thou wilt not do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep thy flock. I will pass through thy flock today, removing from thence all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle amongst the sheep, and the spotted and speckled amongst the goats, and of such shall be my hire. So what he's saying is, listen, I'll go through the animals, and all the bad ones, all the ones with blemishes, all the ones with lines on their skin, I'll take those away, okay, as my wages, but you can have all the good ones. Okay, that's what he promised to do. Verse 23, so shall my righteous answer from me in time to come, when it shall come for my hire before thy face, every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the sheep, thou shalt be counted stolen from me. See that? And Laban said, behold, I would it might be according to thy word. And he removed that day the he-goats with the ring straight and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had white in it, and all the brown amongst the sheep, and gave them into the hand of his sons. And he set 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. And Jacob took him rods of green poplar, and of the hazel and the chestnut tree, and piled white strakes in them, and made the white appear which was in the rods. Now, I'm not quite sure what Jacob's doing. Jacob knew what he was doing. And I haven't had an opportunity to speak to a shepherd about this, or a husbandman, or a vet about this. But I'll tell you what I think was happening. Jacob was a very bright guy. He knew about sheep. And I think what he was doing is he was trying to get one over on Laban, because he's up to his tricks again. And I think what he was doing is he was poisoning the sheep so that they became sick. And when they became sick, he could say, oh, they're mine. They're the ones that are sick. I have the ones that are sick. Do you see the point? So he was stealing, really, by poisoning the sheep of his uncle. And he set the rods which he had piled before the flocks in the gutters, in the watering troughs, when the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. Apparently, there are certain things that can be done with sheep and with other animals and goats, in which a little bit of poison in the water can cause them to cast their young immediately. The female animals, they know that they're poisoned, and they don't want the little baby to be poisoned in their womb, so they just bear them straight away, and very often they die. And that's what Jacob was doing. And Jacob did, verse 40, Jacob did separate the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the ring straight, and all the brown of the flock of Laban, and put his own flock by himself, and put them not into Laban's cattle. And it came to pass, whensoever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the cattle were feeble, he put them not in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger were Jacob's. So Jacob now had completely turned everything around. He was manipulating the herds. He was manipulating the flocks for his own personal advantage. Now, don't forget, in previous chapters, we learned how at a particular time in Jacob's life, he'd had this conversation with the Lord, and he said, Lord, if you'd look after me, if you protect me, if you keep me well, and you feed me, and give me bread to eat and water to drink, then you'll be my God. That was a great arrangement. However, he wasn't doing that, was he? He was up to his old tricks again. He was actually cheating his uncle, really, by manipulating the flocks. He wasn't really trusting in the Lord. Verse 43, and the man increased exceedingly, and had much cattle and maidservants and men servants and camels and asses. So you could say, Jacob could say, well, it's expedient, isn't it? It works. Of course it works. When you poison cattle, that works to whatever advantage you want it to be. But it's not honest, is it? It's not righteous in the sight of the Lord to act in this fashion. So Jacob is up to his old tricks. We talked about this in past weeks, didn't we? Where we talked about Jacob being the tricky one, the one who's got all the answers. He's got all the tricks up his sleeves. He'd been taught by his mother how to cheat his father, and now he's cheating his uncle. He's now getting his own back on his uncle. Not that Laban didn't deserve it, but he shouldn't have done it anyway. So he's in the field of feathering his own nest with Laban's sheep. That's what he's doing. Now, he understood how to manipulate the situation. He made the sheep sick, and he took the sick ones as his own, but they eventually became the ones that were the strongest, because this little bit of a sickness would cause them to cast their young, but the young were not affected by the poison, so they would have been the strong ones. So Jacob is building up his flock. Now, let me ask you something. Is he trusting in God like he promised? No, he's not. You can't trust in God and then do wicked things to provide for yourself. And that's exactly what Jacob was about. He was not trusting in God. He was trusting in his own cunning and in his own deceptions. Laban knew nothing about this. Laban was he was literally being fleeced by Jacob, in spite of the fact that he actually did deserve it. But it shouldn't have been something that Jacob should have ever done. Wow, there's so many lessons in here. It's so full of lessons, but it teaches us about the importance of dealing with people righteously and of dealing with people with utter honesty. Jacob wasn't like this at this time. He still had a long way to go. He still had a long way to go. He was building up many enemies. Laban was an enemy of his. He was becoming an enemy of his. Okay, people could say, well, it was Laban's fault because he did all sorts of things against Jacob. Yes, I know, but that's no excuse. That's no excuse. It's no excuse for Jacob to act like this to his uncle. He should have come out of the whole thing as a righteous man, and he wasn't coming out righteous at all. He was coming out as a trickster, and that's not a good testimony for any man. Well, there we are. There's our passage for today. So what a fascinating thing it is to read like this. Good. I'll just call Ruth so that we can have communion.